For any parent, just the thought of a military draft can be incredibly stressful. So, to help you cut through the noise, we've put together this explainer. It's a clear, factual guide to the Selective Service System. And we're going to focus on the legal ways your child might be able to postpone or even get an exemption from service if a draft ever came back.
So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with how the draft system is kind of always there, waiting in the wings. Then we'll talk about what happens if your number is called. From there, we'll walk through all the options, temporary delays, the really important topic of conscientious objection, what it means to be declared unfit for service, and finally, we'll cover permanent exemptions and bust a few myths you've probably heard. Okay, first things first, let's be absolutely clear. Right now, the U.S. does not have an active draft. It hasn't since 1973. But and this is the key thing for every parent to get. The system to start a draft is fully operational. It's ready to go if Congress and the president ever give it the green light.
So, what does the standby system actually look like? Let's break down the basics.
It's all run by the Selective Service System, or the SSS. Think of it as an independent government agency whose main job is just to keep a massive database of all the men who are eligible for a potential draft. It's really just a contingency plan, but it's one that's always on, just in case.
So who has to sign up? Well, the requirement is incredibly broad. It covers male U.S. citizens and most male immigrants from age 18 all the way through 25. And they have to register within 30 days of their 18th birthday. It's really important to understand that not doing this has serious lifelong consequences. It can affect things like federal student aid, getting a federal job, and for immigrants, it can even impact their citizenship process. Okay, so registration is a must. We get that. But what happens if a draft is actually called? How does the whole thing get started? Well, it all kicks off with a lottery. And this isn't about your background or where you live. It is a totally random drawing of birthdays that decides the call-up order, and they start with 20-year-olds first. If your son's number gets picked, he'll get an official induction notice in the mail. Now, that notice is the critical trigger. It is the only time when he can officially file a claim for a delay or an exemption. After that, he'd have to report to a military entrance processing station, or MEPS, for a full evaluation.
And this brings us to the biggest question for any parent, right? What are your options once that induction notice actually shows up in the mailbox?
So the first set of options on the table are temporary delays, and they come in two main flavors. Now, it's really easy to get these two mixed up, but the difference is pretty important. A postponement. Think of that as a short-term delay for a specific temporary thing, like finishing a school year. A deferment, on the other hand, is usually a longer delay that's based on a more serious, ongoing situation. So, for example, the high school kid can get a postponement until he graduates. A college student can usually finish their current semester. Pretty straightforward, short-term stuff. Deferments, though, are for bigger situations, like if someone is the only person supporting their family and leaving would cause an extreme hardship. Or for students who are actively studying to become ministers. All right, now we're moving into one of the most complex, but also one of the most vital topics for anyone with deeply held beliefs against war, conscientious objection. So a conscientious objector, or a CO, is someone who is opposed to serving the military because of their moral, ethical, or religious principles. And what's really critical to understand here is that the Supreme Court has made it clear that these beliefs don't have to be tied to a traditional church or even a belief in God. The Department of Defense itself defines it as a firm, fixed, and sincere objection to participation in war in any form. The keywords there are sincere and in any form. This is a huge deal. It can't just be a political disagreement with a specific war. It has to be a core belief against all war that's a central part of that person's life. So if a conscientious objector claim gets approved, there are two possible paths. The first is Class 1AO. This is for people who are against combat, but they're willing to serve in the military in a non-combatant role. Think medic or maybe an administrative job. The other is Class 1O. This is for people who are against all forms of military service. They would have to do some kind of alternative civilian work that helps the country. Now, the process for this is tough. It has to be taken very, very seriously. After filing the claim, you have to go in person and explain your beliefs to a local board, provide detailed written statements, and bring in witnesses who can talk about how sincere your beliefs are and for how long you've held them. And that is why, for anyone who holds these beliefs, it is so crucial to have a record of them long before a draft is ever even on the table. Things like letters, journals, or being part of certain groups can be vital evidence. And if the claim is denied, there is an appeals process. Okay, next up is a more straightforward and honestly a pretty common way to be exempted. getting disqualified for medical reasons. This is officially known as Classification 4F. It just means that a person has been found unqualified for military service because they don't meet the really strict physical, mental, or moral fitness standards that the Department of Defense sets. The list of conditions that could get you disqualified is really long. It covers everything from vision and breathing issues like uncontrolled asthma to systemic diseases like diabetes and even a history of certain mental health or neurological conditions. Now, this isn't a complete list, and sometimes waivers are possible, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what the military's medical examiners are looking for. And finally, let's look at the few groups of people who can get a permanent pass from service. And let's clear up a really common myth while we're at it. So, certain jobs and situations come with a permanent exemption. This includes ordained ministers, some high-level elected officials while they're in office, and veterans who have already served their time. There's also something called a surviving son or brother rule, but this only applies during peacetime and only if a parent or sibling died as a direct result of their military service. And that brings us to something that we have to make perfectly clear. There is a very old, very stubborn myth that an only son is automatically exempt from the draft. Let's just say it plainly. This is completely false. There's absolutely nothing in the law that exempts you for being an only child, an only son, or the last one to carry on the family name. The surviving son thing is strictly tied to a death in the family from military service. So what's clear is that while the draft might be asleep, the system definitely is not. There are clear legal paths for delays and exemptions, but the key is understanding the rules before a crisis ever happens. And all this leaves us with a final big question. With our current all-volunteer military facing some serious recruiting challenges, what role, if any, could this long-dormant system play in our country's future?